Life is not only difficult, at times it is scary. Sometimes we find ourselves in a situation that scares us, and we don't know what to do. Some people look for ways to escape the situation. Get me out of here. Other people get excited to see what God is going to do. What about you? Do you see a tragedy in every opportunity, or do you see an opportunity in every tragedy? This morning we are going to see a young man who had a very hard life. And at times his life was scary. Still, he never asked God to get him out of there. He waited to see what God was going to do. And God did great things for him. You serve a great God. Expect him to do great things for you. Today we are going to start the story of David. Since he had a long and complex life, we will divide it into 4 parts, 4 Sundays. His early life under King Saul, his life on the run as a fugitive, his life as a king, and his family life. So let's start today with his early life and see his first 4 jobs. Please turn to 1 Samuel chapter 16. Because of his disobedience, if you remember, Saul was rejected by God to continue as king of Israel. God looked for another candidate. He sent Samuel to the home of a man named Jesse in Bethlehem. Jesse was the 10th direct descendant of Jacob. We are not told much about Jesse. We'd like to know more about him, but we are not given much information in the Bible. He was already an old man when we first meet him. We are not told anything about David's mom. God worked in a strange way in providing for himself a king. The lonely sheepfolds of Bethlehem was a strange school for a future king. We will see that David was forgotten. He was neglected by his father. He was mocked by his brothers. But that did not stop him. Jesse had 8 sons, and God wanted one of them. So we read in verse 6, so it was when they came that he, Samuel, looked at Eliab and said, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. And he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. Then Jesse made Shammah pass by. And he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. Impressed by the look and the size of Eliab, the firstborn, Samuel was sure that this was the guy. This was the one that the Lord wanted, verse 6. He looked a little bit like Saul. Tall, good looking. But Samuel was wrong. God told him, and he does not see as man sees, in verse 7. Jesse made 2 more guys pass before Samuel in verses 8 and 9. But the Lord had not chosen those either. in verses 10 and 11, Jesse made the other 4 sons pass before Samuel. But he said the Lord had not chosen any of these 7 sons. Confused, wondering if God had sent him to the wrong address, Samuel asked if Jesse had another son. In verse 11, Jesse said, there is another one, the youngest of the family, a kid, a nobody. He's outside keeping the sheep. And Samuel asked him to bring him in. So we read in verse 12. So Jesse sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy with bright eyes, good looking. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is the one. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel arose and he went home to Ramah. When Jesse brought David in, he was ruddy. What's that mean, ruddy? It means he was healthy, reddish stone. Healthy glow from working outside in the field with the animal. He had a good tan. Right away, the Lord said that this is the one, anoint him. And Samuel anointed him with oil in the kitchen in front of the brothers, but he did not tell anyone what he was being anointed for. There is no mention of the word king anywhere in this conversation. There was no mention that he would be the next king. He was chosen by God for a special task. As I mentioned before, when we read about God choosing people, it is not referring ever to salvation. It is referring to vocation. The mistake that Jean Calvin made and his followers was to assume that God's choice was strictly about salvation. God was choosing people to be saved. God does not do that. He chooses people for service. He anoints them for a special call to serve him. Jesus chose 12 men to be his disciples, to represent him, and he sent them in his name. Judas was chosen as one of the 12 for a vocation. It was not for salvation. So from that moment here, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David and left Saul. It would be years before David would wear Saul's crown, but from this day forward, the kingdom was secure for David. So Samuel went back home, verse 13. In verses 14 to 23, we see David's early life under King Saul. We read in verse 14, but the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a distressing spirit from the Lord troubled him. And Saul's servants said to him, surely a distressing spirit from God is troubling you. Let our master now command your servants who are before you to seek out a man who is skillful player on the harp. And it shall be that he will play it with his hand when the distressing spirit from God is upon you, and you shall be well. God's plan was to bring David into the kingdom. He had to be coming into the castle. We see in this section how God made it happen. As soon as the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, he became afflicted with a form of mental disorder caused by an evil spirit. Now, Dr. Randall Short analyzed the king's problem, and he said, and I quote him, King Saul would be diagnosed today as a typical example of manic depressive insanity. The periods of intense gloom with occasional outbreaks of homicidal violence for no particular reason, the delusion that people were plotting against him, all these signs are unmistakable. Mental disorder. Now, we have to be careful with the expression, a distressing spirit from the Lord. Verse 14. That spirit did not come from the Lord as it appears. It was allowed by the Lord to come to Saul. It seems like the Lord places a wall of protection around his people. We see it clearly in the book of Job. Satan was complaining about this wall of protection around Job. When God removed that wall of protection around Job, now Satan was able to get to him. Here, when God removed that wall of protection around Saul, then that evil, distressing spirit was able to come to him. It was allowed by God to come and trouble the man. But be careful not to think that the distressing spirit came from the Lord. Saul's servants acknowledged that a distressing spirit was troubling their king in verse 15. So they suggest that a skillful harp player be found in verse 16. They were convinced that their king would be well. Music is known to comfort the soul and the spirit. I mentioned earlier that milk producers are convinced that cows produce more milk when music is played in the barn. It calms them, and it covers the noises that would freak them out. It calms them. In verses 17 to 23, Saul agreed that a skillful harp player would help. And he asked them to please find one in verse 17. David's name was suggested in verse 18. And Saul sent for him in verse 19. David arrived at the castle with a gift from his dad, verse 20. And right away, King Saul loved him, in verse 21, but not for long. That was David's second job. He became royal harpist. His first job was a shepherd in the field. So he was a shepherd, but now he was the royal harpist. Obviously, David was a good player. His music lifted the king out of his depression. A bad harp player can be a real nightmare to listen to, believe me. Saul liked David's so well that he gave him a third job. He made him his personal armor bearer in verse 21. Then he asked Jesse, David's father, to let him stay at the castle. Let your boy stay here. And whenever the spirit troubled Saul, David got the harp, played, and Saul was refreshed. Chapter 17 deals with the great story of David and Goliath that the whole world knows about. In that story, we see opportunities in the first 27 verses. Then we see obstacles in the rest of the chapter to verse 58. Usually people do not get one without the other. Every obstacle comes with an opportunity. So now, verse 1. The Philistines gathered their armies together to battle and were gathered at Soko, which belonged to Judah. They encamped between Soko and Azekah in Ephes Damim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side with a valley between them. And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had a bronze armor on his legs and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now, the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. This is the second time Israel faced the Philistine under King Saul. Remember, the first time was in chapter 13. So now under King Saul, they're going to face the Philistines again. The Philistines gathered their army for battle near the valley of Elah, southwest of Jerusalem, not far from Gath. Saul and his army assembled nearby with the valley of Elah between them. A champion, a big man by the name of Goliath, came out of the Philistine camp every day for 40 days, defying the armies of Israel to send him a worthy opponent. But there were no volunteers. Why not? The giant was 9 foot 9 inches tall. He wore about 175 pounds of armor, more than David's 150 pounds soaking wet. His iron spear alone weighed over 15 pounds, just the head of it. The heavy weapons were no problem for Goliath, since he himself must have weighed over 600 pounds, that big guy. He had many times over the strength of a normal man. So the story continues in verse 8. Then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, "Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servant of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. And if he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man, that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Here the giant came up with a shortcut. Instead of starting an all-out war and shed a lot of blood, he offered a compromise, a less bloody mess. The deal was this: if a man from the camp of Israel would fight Goliath and kill him, the Philistines would serve Israel. But if the Goliath would kill the Jewish fighter, Israel would serve the Philistine. So confident of himself, he said, "Give me a man to fight." Verse 10. Saul might have been head and shoulder above all the others. Still, he was not big enough to face Goliath. He and all Israel were troubled when they heard the words of the jolly green giant. In verse 11. In verses 12 to 18, the story moves for a moment from the valley of Elah to the house of Jesse, the father of David, in Bethlehem. Jesse had 8 sons, and 3 of them were with Saul in his army. Verse 13. David, the youngest, a teenager, was too young for military service. So even though he had 2 new jobs, royal harpist and armor bearer for the king, he never forgot his first job, a shepherd. He was a shepherd boy. And he knew that his dad would need help with his sheep, so whenever he could, he would go back to help dad at home. He was a good boy. Meanwhile, in the valley of Elah, Goliath continued his challenge every morning and every evening, looking for a man to fight. While at home, Jesse decided to send David to the battlefront to bring provision for his 3 older boys who were in the army with Saul, as well as some cheeses for the captain. Jesse knew how to butter up those in authority. So David did not arrive there by accident. God brought the right man to the right place at the right time. The story goes on in verse 19. Now Saul and they, the 3 sons of Jesse, and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, and took the things and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to the fight and shouting for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army, and David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper, and he ran to the army, and he came and greeted his brothers. Then as he talked with them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines, and he spoke according to the same words. So David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, they fled from him, and they were dreadfully afraid. The story returned to the battlefield in the valley of Elah. From Bethlehem to the valley of Elah is about 10 miles. David got there just in time to hear the champion as he was coming again to challenge the Jews. David heard his word. Everyone was dreadfully afraid. Verse 24. In verses 25 to 27, the men of Israel told David what the reward will be to the man who kills this giant. David asked them to repeat what will be done for the man who silenced this arrogant brute. The reward to the man able to kill this giant was threefold. Number 1, he will be enriched with great riches. Number 2, he will be given the king's daughter as wife. And number 3, he will be given tax exemption for his family. Pretty good deal. The king must have been pretty scared to offer tax exemption. No government offered tax exemption. Ask any church. So after the opportunities, here comes the obstacle. There will be 4 of them. In verses 28 to 30, we have the first 2 obstacles. And it came from David's own family. Eliab, his older brother, mocked him. He said to him, "You are supposed to be in charge of a few sheep. That's all you're good for. What are you doing here?" Verse 28. The first obstacle was mockery from his own brother. And the brother goes on and he says, "You are filled with pride and insolence in your heart," accusing his brother wrongly. David had been asked by his dad to go. There was no pride and insolence in his heart. He was obeying his dad. Eliab rebuked him, probably to mask his own fear, wanting to look powerful. The second obstacle was false accusation, again from his brother. But David was not hindered by his brother. He persisted in checking into the reward awaiting the man who will kill the giant in verse 29. In verses 31 to 39, we see 2 more obstacles that David had to overcome. When Saul saw David, he had serious doubt about the youth ability. And he said, "You're not able to go against this Philistine. You're just a kid. You're nobody. He's a man of war." Verse 33. But David had experienced the power of God working through him before, when he defended his flock against a lion and a bear. Verses 34 to 36. He had proved God in private. Now he could rely on God in public. Here we see David's 4th job. He will become a fighter. So shepherd, harpist, armor bearer, fighter. But the 3rd obstacle was ridicule or embarrassment from his employer. The man is his boss. "You cannot do that. You're just a kid. Sit down." But seeing his courage and determination, Saul said, "Okay, go, but may the Lord be with you." Verse 37. Then he loaded David with heavy equipment, too large, too heavy for him: a bronze helmet, a coat of mail, a sword. David had to discard those things because they were more a hindrance than a help to him. It was so heavy, so bulky, he could hardly walk. So he took them off. Verse 39. The 4th obstacle was hindrance from his employer. But David had a plan. We read in verse 40. Then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and he put them in a shepherd's bag, in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand. And he drew near to the Philistine. So the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good-looking. So the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, with a spear, with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistine to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. So instead of the bulky armor that Saul had offered him, David went with 5 smooth stones and a sling and a staff, and the power of the living God. Now, do not picture the old slingshot, you mean the wide piece with the rubber on the side there. It was a little leather pouch with 2 leather straps. It was the shepherd's weapon. He would spin it with a stone inside and let go of one strap, and the rock inside would get out to hit the target. Was that thing accurate? The Bible tells us that 200 men from the tribe of Benjamin, at 100 paces away, could hit at a hair's breadth with those things. So they were pretty accurate. In verses 48 to 53, when Goliath saw David, who was a teenager, he was infuriated. He was insulted that Israel would send him a kid to fight him. But David had not a trace of fear as he responded to the giant curses. He had complete faith that the Lord would give him the victory. He had no doubt. The Philistines were in the promised land. They had no right to be there. The place belonged to God's people, and David knew that. The Philistine defied God and his word and used all the worldly means at their disposal to establish themselves right there in position of power over God's people. David reminded the giant that he was coming against him with sword, spear, and javelin, but he was coming to him in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom this giant had defied. So confident that the Lord will deliver the giant to him, he said, I will take your head from you. Verse 46, who in the world, a teenager, would say to a 9-footer, I want to take your head off? Takes a lot of guts or a lot of faith. He had a lot of faith, and he took the man's head. There was not a single doubt in the mind of David. God was going to do it. Oh, the power of faith when it is not mixed with any doubt. As Goliath moved towards him, David hurried. He ran to meet the Philistines. I would have run the other way. He ran to him. This is not the move of a scared person. And then he slung his first stone. He hit the man in the forehead, verse 49. And the giant fell forward on his face. All it took was one lousy stone to take down the prideful giant, verse 50. David then used Goliath's own sword to kill him, and he cut his head off, verse 51, just as he had said he would do. When the armies of the Philistines saw this, their giant is down, the head is gone, they fled, and the men of Israel pursued them and plundered their tent. And the story ends, verse 54, and David took the head of the Philistine and he brought it to Jerusalem. He walked with it, but he put his armor in his tent. When Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, as your soul lives, O king, I do not know. So the king said, inquire whose son this young man is. Then as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? So David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. Now, here we have the conclusion of the story. David carried the head of the giant to Jerusalem, and it takes a few days to get there. He carried that thing. Then he placed the armor of the giant in his own tent, verse 54. Quite a souvenir. But somehow the sword of Goliath ended up with Ahimelech, the priest, later in chapter 21. We don't know how it ended up there. Now, people see a problem with verse 55. They think it is strange that Saul would not recognize David after he had already appointed him to play the harp and appointed him to be his armor bearer. Chapter 16, verse 21. But pay attention. It does not say that Saul did not know who this young hero was. It simply says he asked, whose son is this? Saul could easily have forgotten David's family name, the last name. Saul had promised exemption of taxation to the family of the winner. So he wanted to make sure. As we continue, we will see that David never got what was promised to the winner. Au contraire, Saul mistreated him, and David will have to go in hiding. Saul was given another chance to prove himself, and he failed it. He was a rebellious, disobedient man, and he could not be used by God. So the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul and came upon David. Saul was out of fellowship with God. And when leaders are out of fellowship with God, they can only lead others into defeat. God accepts the worship only if he can accept the worshiper. You can ask Cain. Saul began in the spirit and ended up in the flesh. When everything is done in the flesh, there is no room for the Spirit to work. That's when he departs. Goliath is the greatest example of Proverbs 16:18. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before the fall. His pride caused him to fall and led him to destruction. He was overconfident. He was so sure of himself. He was so big, so huge, so strong. No way anybody could get him. And he fell flat on his face. Beware. When God uses you, obstacles will come one after the other. People will mock you, will falsely accuse you, will ridicule you, will embarrass you, will hinder you. Anything to get you to stop serving God. David had to face the mocking of 3 critics: Eliab, his brother; Saul, his boss; Goliath, his enemy. Eliab represents the home critic. He questioned David's motive. Why? Why are you here? Why do you do that? When you serve God, your own family members will mock you and question your motive. Saul represents the official critics, and he questioned David's meaning. How? How are you going to do it? How can you possibly do that? You are not fully equipped. You need better tools. When you serve God, officials will question your resources. How were you ordained? What university did you go to? And Goliath represents the enemy critic. He questioned David's strength. What? One was why, the other one was how, Goliath was what? What can you do? What ability do you have? What power can help you? You're too young, you're too short, you're too weak. When you serve God, your enemies will question your strength. David had one answer to all 3 questions. What was the answer? God. Why am I here? God. How can I do it? God. What power will help me? God. Back to verse 28 for a second. When Eliab, the older brother, asked David why he had come, David answered, verse 29, "Is there not a cause?" What does it mean? Is there not a cause? It means nothing happens by chance. There is a cause. There is a reason. David could say, "It is not by chance that I was born into Jesse's family. It is not by chance that I have 7 other brothers. It is not by chance that I have learned early to love, trust, and obey God. It is not by chance that God has become my constant companion and my guide. It is not by chance that I have learned to play the harp and write beautiful hymns. Such things do not happen by chance. They happen by God's design." David could go on. "It is not by chance that I became a shepherd with a heart for the flock. It is not by chance that God gave me the courage to face the lion and the bear in the wilderness. It is not by chance that I have the skills to use a sling and stone. It is not by chance that I am not afraid of Goliath. And likewise, it is not by chance that you were born where you were born. It is not by chance that you have the gifts and the abilities that you have. Nothing about your life is by chance. Learn today. Nothing happens by chance. Here is a twofold test for you, and I close with that. Number one is, do you see a tragedy in every opportunity, or do you see an opportunity in every tragedy? And number two, when you are confronted by a Goliath-sized problem, do you say it's too big to hit or it's too big to miss? How do you see things? Ask God today to give you the faith of David, able to see God and not only see the giant problem. Great faith makes great men and great women. If your confidence is purely in the power of God rather than the power of armor and connections and money and skills, you will have the victory. God is with those who trust Him. So trust Him. Next week, we'll continue with part 2, David's life on the run. Saul was asked to kill the Amalekites, all of them. That was a test, and he failed the test. David had one test, killed one man, had his faith crack, and he had a moment of fear as he looked and approached this giant. Half of the Bible would be different. It would be totally different. We don't know if he would have ever become king. We don't know what would have happened to this man, but he did not fail the test. The previous man failed his test. He did not. Why not? He's a young punk. He's a young teenager. He's got no skills. He's got no wisdom. But he has God. Amen. And he trusted in God. That's all he had. That's all he needed. So no matter what obstacle going to come your way, big, huge, you may not have the experience. You may not know what to do. But you have God with you. Trust Him and move upon your trust. Show your trust by moving. David could have said, oh, I trust God, but I'm not going. I trust God. No, he trusted God and he ran to that man. That's how confident he was that God was with him. He ran. And when you are confident that God is with you, you will run to take care of that giant problem. So may the Lord be with you. May the Lord bless each and every one of you. May He bless your home, your family. May He keep you safe during this season. And may He bless your home and your children. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.